Chapter 21 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge. Chapter 21. The Days of Chivalry. My knights are sworn to vows of utter hardihood, utter gentleness and loving, utter faithfulness in love, and uttermost obedience to the King. Tennyson. Let us now take a look at Europe during the Crusades and see how the people of these Middle Ages struggled from out of the Dark Ages, which followed the fall of Rome, to something higher and better. We have seen how the Romans had lost their old loyal spirit. Falsehood, treachery, ingratitude. These were among the vices that had crept in to mar their manhood. A new order of things was coming, which with the rapid spread of Christianity raised the people of Europe to a higher and better state, lifting them then, as now, beyond the civilizations of the East. The Crusades did for the countries of the West that which nothing else had done. They gave unity. A common danger made all men one. A spirit of loyalty and patriotism began slowly to rise. The idea of honorable service dawned on men, and out of the darkness of the past arose a wonderful system of chivalry. The word in French means literally one who rode on horseback. Thus the warrior who served on horseback was called a knight. Let us see how a boy could become a knight in these days of long ago, known as the Middle Ages. Everywhere in Europe had risen great castles in which dwelt the large landowners or lords, the wealthiest men in the kingdoms. To these castles the little boy of 7 years old was sent to serve as a page to the great man of the castle. Here he learnt how to use arms, how to ride, and to become strong and useful. He learnt to obey, to be courteous, to serve his lords and ladies honorably, and to acquit himself well. At the age of 14 the page became a squire, and acted as a personal attendant to his lord. If he were brave and true, he was soon allowed to accompany his master to the field, to lead his war horse on the march, to buckle on his armor for the fight, keeping ever close to his side to help him in danger and to give him aid in need. The ambition of every boy was to become a knight himself, a rank which made him equal in dress, in arms, and in title to the rich landowners. If he could distinguish himself in battle, or show himself courteous and honorable in times of peace, he was admitted to this holy order. The preparation was severe. The young squire was first bathed and arrayed in white robes, in token of the unstained honor required by the laws of chivalry. New armor was given to him, and sword in hand, he had to watch these arms all night in church, till in the early morning service was performed. His sword was then laid on the altar and blessed, while some older knight conferred on the young warrior the order of knighthood. As he knelt to take the solemn vow, he swore to protect the distressed, to maintain right against might, and never by word or deed to stain his character as a knight and as a Christian. "Be thou a good and faithful knight," said the older man, touching the kneeling figure before him with the edge of the sword. Then all present helped to lace on his helmet, gird his sword belt, and bind on the gilt spurs which were the outward symbols of knighthood. Added to this, he might now dress in rich silks and wear scarlet, while his horse might be clad in mail. And still in Europe the different nations have their orders of knighthood, given for some distinguished service to king and country, while each can look back to the ages long past and still boast of a Roland, an Arthur, or a Cid, heroes of the ancient knighthood. The Crusades, then, were a splendid chance for the young warriors of Europe to win their spurs, to show themselves loyal to their lord and to their king, to maintain right against might. So upon the rude manners and customs of the barbarian invaders arose from the Crusades a spirit of chivalry, which added grace and glory to the Middle Ages. And the new sun rose, bringing the new year. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge. Chapter 22. Queen of the Adriatic. Where Venice sate in state, throned on her 100 isles. Byron. Another result of the Crusades was the great stimulus given to commerce and trade in Europe. Let us take a look at the center of Europe's trade at this time. Away in the far north of the Adriatic Sea, which washes the shores of eastern Italy, are some 72 small islands or mud banks. They are surrounded by the shallow water of the sea, which laps peacefully round their shores. A very network of channels and pools and lagoons, as they are called. On these islands, and amid this waste of waters, arose Venice, a city famous in the Middle Ages for the genius and industry of her people, who had built up for themselves a commercial greatness of which the world was justly proud. There is a glorious city in the sea. The sea is in the broad, the narrow streets, ebbing and flowing, and the salt seaweed clings to the marble of her palaces. No track of men, no footsteps to and fro, lead to her gates. The path lies o'er the sea, invisible. It seemed an unpromising foundation for such a city, but quantities of salt from the lagoons and unlimited fish from the sea supplied the people with articles of trade, in exchange for which they got timber for their ships, among other things. To such a race, life on the water was yet more natural than life on land, and they soon became daring and expert sailors. With each age, their ships increased in size and number, until they became the chief carriers of Europe. The spirit of the Crusades reached this city of the waters, and she sent no less than 207 ships to help Godfrey de Bouillon on the first crusade. It was to Venice, then, that the future Crusaders looked, when they wanted to cross the Mediterranean Sea for the Holy Land. This traffic brought the Venetians into contact with the rich stores of the boundless East, and costly cargoes returning with the returning ships. This little sea-girt state was ruled over by a duke, or doge, as he was called, and there is a curious old story about one of these doges in the olden days. Venice had joined the League of Lombardy against Frederick Barbarossa, and had gained a sea victory over the German fleet. In command of the Venetian fleet was the doge. As soon as he touched land, on his return from victory, the Pope himself hastened to the shore and presented him with a ring of gold. "Take this ring," he said, "and with it the sea as your subject. Every year, on the return of this happy day, you and your successors shall make known to all that the right of conquest has made subject the Adriatic to Venice, as a bride to her husband." The Venetians brought forth their state ship, glorious with new scarlet and gold, its decks and seats inlaid with costly woods and rowed with long banks of burnished oars. Seated on a magnificent throne was the doge. Gliding through the silent canals, now ringing with festal music and the shouts of the triumphant Venetians, this gorgeous ship reached the harbor. Here the doge dropped the golden ring into the clear, still waters of the Adriatic, plighting the troth of Venice in these words: "We wed thee, O sea, in token of our true and eternal dominion over thee." For 600 years the Venetians repeated this ceremony, until Venice fell, unable to compete longer with the trade of the New World. But these were the days of her glory, when as Queen of the Adriatic she ruled the seas of southern Europe. With the start of the Fifth Crusade she showed her full strength. It would take too long to tell how the blind old Doge Dandolo led his countrymen to the wars; of the glorious fleet that sailed so proudly down the Adriatic, with gay streamers blazoned with the cross flying in the wind; of the lords and knights of France who sailed from Venice on their way to the Holy Land. But they turned aside from the object of the expedition and sailed to Constantinople instead. When the Crusaders beheld the lofty walls and goodly towers of this Queen of the Earth, There was not a man whose heart did not tremble within him. For since the creation of the world, says the old chronicler, never had such an enterprise been attempted by a handful of men. It was mainly owing to the dauntless ardor of the old Doge that Constantinople fell into the hands of the Venetians. Old and blind as he was, he stood upon the prow of his galley, with the standard of St. Mark spread before him, urging his people to push on to the shore. Then, the first to leap out, he reassured the fainting hearts of his warriors, and soon the Venetian standard was flying from one of the towers of Constantinople. From the days of Constantine, treasure had been collected from all parts of the world and stored in this Queen of Cities. She had been the seat of learning for centuries, the storehouse and home of all that was beautiful. Now all was swept away. Marbles, pictures, statues, prizes from Egypt, Greece, and Rome, which had made Constantine's city the wonder of nations, all disappeared under the cruel hands of the Crusaders. Dandolo became Doge of Venice and lord of 1/8 of the Roman Empire, and the triumph of Venice was complete. Still today may be seen in Venice the famous bronze horses taken from Constantinople in this 13th century by Dandolo. Still the streets of water ebb and flow as the silent boats, gondolas, glide from house to house. And still the winged lions of St. Mark command this city of the waters, though her ships no longer dominate the sea. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge. Chapter 23. The Story of Marco Polo. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All times I have enjoyed greatly and suffered greatly. Tennyson. The Crusades had brought about a contact of East and West, but though they had raised the general standard of life and made the riches of the East, gold, silks, spices, and jewels, familiar throughout Europe, yet the geography of the East was strangely misty and undefined. To the men of the Middle Ages the world was still very limited. The great Atlantic, which was soon to open out a new world, was yet known as the Sea of Darkness, and many attempts to fathom its mysteries had ended in dismal failure. Still more alarming was the idea of a sea of pitchy darkness, which was supposed to lie to the east of Asia. In the north, the old Vikings, having discovered Iceland and sailed by the northern shores of America without knowing it, had become a settled people, and no longer terrified the world by their coasting raids. Africa, except for the strip of northern coast, and Egypt, was still a closed book, and nothing was known of the south and west. This was somewhat the state of affairs when Marco Polo arose, traveled away to the far east, sailed on the Sea of Pitchy Darkness, and returned home, after many years, travel-stained and unrecognizable, to give the world an account of his wonderful doings. It seems somewhat natural to find that Venice was the birthplace of this early explorer, for Venice, as we have seen, had the enterprise of the whole world at this time. The very year that Marco Polo was born in Venice, 1254, his father and uncle had started forth on a trading enterprise to Constantinople. They were away for some 15 years, and when they came back they had some wonderful stories to tell the young Marco. They told him how they had reached China and been at the court of the Chinese ruler, the Great Khan, as he was called. The boy was fired with enthusiasm to go to this distant country and to see for himself the wonders of the mysterious new land. 2 years later, when the father and uncle started off again, they took young Marco with them. They sailed from Venice to Acre, but nothing is related of their journey except that they traveled towards the northeast and north, till, after 3½ years, they reached the city of the Great Khan, who was at his summer home among the hills to the north of Peking. The great man, lord of all the earth as he was called, was very glad to see them, and asked at once who was the young man with them. "Sire," answered his father, "'tis my son and your liegeman." "Welcome is he too," said the great Khan. Marco soon picked up the language and customs of the Chinese, and became a great favorite at this strange foreign court. Once the great Khan sent him on a journey, a good 6 months' journey distant. Marco returned safely, and so ably did he state all that he had seen and heard that the great Khan cried, "If this young man live, he will become a person of great worth and ability." For 17 years the three Polos stayed in China, and Marco explored countries which to this day are hardly understood. He was the first traveler to cross Asia, describing kingdom after kingdom that he had seen with his own eyes. He was the first to explore the deserts and the flowering plains of Persia, to tell the Western world of China with its mighty rivers, its multitudes of people, its huge cities and great manufactures. He first told us of Tibet, Burma, Japan, Siberia, and the frozen ocean beyond. So the years passed on, the great Khan was growing old, and the Venetians yearned for home. But whenever they hinted at leaving China, the Khan growled refusal. At last their chance came. A relation of the great Khan was king of Persia. He had lately lost his wife, and now sent to China for a wife of his own nationality. The Polos were chosen to take her to Persia, because they were hardy and adventurous, and the lady must be sent by sea to Persia. 14 ships were built by the great Khan, each having 4 masts and able to carry 9 sails, with some 250 sailors in each. In these ships the Polos sailed away from China with the bride elect on board. They took a sorrowful leave of the great Khan, who gave them numbers of rubies and precious stones. After sailing for 3 months in the unknown China Sea, they came to the island of Java, and after another 18 months on the high seas they reached Persia, to find that the bridegroom was dead. But his son, the new king, married the lady without more ado, and the Venetians sailed on for home. So one day in the year 1295, 3 men appeared in the streets of Venice. They were dressed in Asiatic clothes and spoke with a foreign accent. It was therefore no great matter of surprise when they were refused admission to the family house of the Polos. "We have been in the service of the great Khan in China," they urged, but no one believed them. So they invited a number of friends to a banquet prepared with great magnificence, and when the hour arrived for sitting down to table, all 3 came forth clothed in long crimson satin robes, after the fashion of the times. When the guests were seated, they took off these robes and put on others of crimson damask, whilst the first suits were cut up and divided among their servants. Soon after they again changed, this time to crimson velvet, while the damask robes were divided as before. Dinner over, Marco rose and fetched the 3 shabby garments in which they had arrived. With sharp knives they then slit up the seams, and from them took the most priceless jewels, rubies, diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires. So their astonished guests knew they had spoke the truth, and all Venice came rushing to do them honor. They stayed at home for a time, and then Marco Polo was made commander of a great and powerful galley to fight against Venice's rival seaport, Genoa. He was taken prisoner and shut up in Genoa. Here Marco Polo wrote his book of travels, which are interesting reading today, and we cannot do better than follow the good advice at the beginning of his book. "Great princes, emperors, and kings," he says, "and people of all degrees who desire to get knowledge of the various races of mankind and of sundry regions of the world, take this book and cause it to be read to you." He was an old man when he had finished dictating his travels to his fellow captive, and he returned to Venice to die. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge, Chapter 24, Dante's Great Poem. The poet is a heroic figure, belonging to all ages. Carlyle. While Marco Polo was living his curious life in the Chinese court of the Great Khan, there was growing up in Florence a man who was to become famous for all time. This Italian, Dante, was to be the spokesman of the Middle Ages. He was to be the voice of the last 10 silent centuries, a very landmark of history. Of his life itself there is but little worthy of record. He first makes his appearance at the age of 9, a shy, sensitive boy with large, dark, dreamy eyes and a curly head full of the strangest fancies. One day at a children's party in Florence, Dante met the little Beatrice, simply enough dressed in a crimson frock. To the dreamy poet boy, the little girl was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and from that day she became, what knighthood was to the young men of the Middle Ages, his ideal, something he must live to be worthy of. Though Beatrice died when Dante was yet a young man of 24, he kept her as his ideal right through his life, and as she plays a large part in his life, so she plays a large part in his great poem. He was educated after the fashion of his day, but with no printed books his knowledge was necessarily limited. All that he learnt was in Latin, which was the language of all learned people at this time. He served in the wars of his country, for Florence was torn by strife and divided by party, and Dante loved Florence as Socrates had loved Athens. The state accepted his talents and devotion, and by the time he was 35 he had risen to a post of honor in the city. Then disturbances arose, feeling ran high, parties were divided, and the result was that Dante, in the full vigor of his manhood, was exiled from his own city, doomed henceforth to a life of woe and wandering. Not only was he banished from Florence, but if caught, he was to be burnt alive. Later it was proposed that Dante should apologize, pay a fine to the state, and return. "If I cannot return without calling myself guilty, I will never return," answered this man with fixed, stern pride. For Dante, now there was no home in the world. He wandered from place to place, from patron to patron, always working to get back to his beloved Florence, but in vain. "How hard is the path!" he exclaims bitterly. Hard it was indeed. Alone, friendless, hopeless, cast out of his home forever, to wander over the face of the cold earth with no living heart to love him, no kindred soul to comfort him. Dante now turned his thoughts to another world, and tried to imagine what it would all be like. And so, brooding over the unknown in speechless gloom, he burst forth at last into the wonderful song we delight in to this day, known as the Divine Comedy. It was the story of a vision Dante supposed he saw, a vision of hell, purgatory, and paradise. It took him years to write, for it was written with pain and toil, with his heart's blood. None could hinder him now. He had found his work to do. He would not rest till the work was done. "Follow thou thy star," he could say to himself in his extremest need. "Thou shalt not fail of a glorious haven." He has passed from the cold world of reality into the spirit world, and all the Christianity that had been creeping over Europe during the Middle Ages is summed up in Dante's great poem. But not only is the Divine Comedy of Dante's the first great Christian poem, but it is the opening of a new European era of song, the beginning of a language and a national literature. For it is written in the Italian language, the language of the people, and not in Latin or Greek, the language of the learned only. A few books had been translated into the language of the people by Alfred the Great of England and other scholars. A few songs had been composed in the language of France. But no great work had been written in any of the languages of modern Europe till Dante wrote his great poem in the language of Italy. So he did more for his country than he can ever have expected to do, when he left it sorrowing and alone, for he laid the foundation of the union of divided Italy. The people in the cities, such as Venice, Milan, and Genoa, were eager to claim Dante as a countryman, one who spoke and wrote in the language of their country. He had become the one world voice. The great work done, the poet died, still in exile, it is said, broken-hearted. In the vision of his life he had reached paradise and had seen again the Beatrice whom he loved, his goal and his ideal. Here we must leave the poet, but from out the long ages Dante still speaks for those to hear who will. I will be thy guide, and bring thee hence by an eternal place. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge. Chapter 25. The Maid of Orleans. The fate of empires and the doom of kings lies clearly spread before my childish mind. Schiller, Maid of Orleans. Almost ever since the death of Dante, war had been raging between England and France. For some 100 years it had gone on, until at last it was ended by a young girl known to history as Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. This is a very wonderful story of how the girl, Joan, saved her country and freed it from the hands of the foreigner. She was born in the year 1412, away in a small village called Domremy, on the outskirts of a great wood. The child loved the forest. Birds and beasts came lovingly to her childish call. She learnt to spin and sew with other little girls, but never learned to read and write. She was tender to the poor and sick, fond of church and the church bells, but her quiet life was soon broken by the storm of war. The King of France died, and his son was proclaimed Charles VII. But the King of England called himself king and refused to acknowledge the French ruler. All this reached the ears of Joan, the little maid, dreaming away in her distant home amid the forests, and she had pity on the fair realm of France. One summer afternoon when Joan was about 13, she thought she heard a voice saying to her, "Joan, be a good child, go often to church." After this she often heard voices speaking to her, until one day she heard this, "Joan, you must go to help the King of France, for you shall give him back his kingdom." "But I am only a poor maiden," pleaded Joan. "I know not how to ride to the wars or to lead men at arms." Then she remembered that Merlin, the old magician who had rescued King Arthur, had said that France should be saved by a maiden from the country. Joan wept and prayed, but she knew that somehow she must go and see the king. "It was for this I was born," she urged, when they laughed at her earnestness. So at last it was settled that she should be taken to the king. It took 11 days to reach the court where Charles was living. Nobles and courtiers awaited the arrival of the peasant girl, half in sport. Even Charles had the playfulness to hide among his courtiers as she entered. But the maid knew him at once. Falling down on her knees before him, "I am sent you by the King of Heaven to tell you that you shall be crowned King of France," she cried. The jesting courtiers grew grave, and the young king listened to her earnest pleading. At last Charles consented to let her go and try her fortune against the English, who were besieging the town of Orleans. So Joan of Arc started forth. For her banner, she had worked the lilies of France in gold upon a white ground on one side, while on the other was the face of God looking down from the clouds upon the earth. As she mounted her charger, clad in white armor from head to foot, her great white banner in one hand, her sword by her side, the rough French soldiers felt proud of following her, for they looked on her as something divine. When she reached Orleans, she found her countrymen ready to give up the town, which had been besieged for 7 long months by the English. Her appearance brought them hope and fresh courage. At the sight of her, in her shining armor, with her mystic banner raised on high, the English were struck with terror. "She is a witch," they said among themselves. Fort after fort had been taken. One strong one remained. Joan was determined to take it. She led out the soldiers against this last fort. The English fought desperately, and the Maid fell wounded. She was carried away. Suddenly she heard that the French were failing. Heedless of her wound, she mounted her horse, unfurled her banner, and returned. "Watch my standard," she cried. "When it touches the walls, you shall enter the fort." The return of this wounded witch at the head of her men filled the English with renewed terror. Suddenly above the din of battle rang out the clear voice of the Maid. "The victory is ours!" It was true. The long, weary siege was ended. Orleans belonged to the French once more, and it was all due to the courage and inspiration of Joan of Arc. Entering the great church at Orleans, she wept so passionately that all the people wept with her. Then, flushed with victory, with the shouts of her fellow soldiers yet ringing in her ears, she made her way to the king. "Come and be crowned king at Rheims," she cried, throwing herself at his feet. And 2 months later she stood in her armor of shining steel, her white banner held on high, to see the king crowned. Her mission was now accomplished, and she wished to go home, but the king forced her to remain. The end of the story is very sad. The English declared that she was indeed a witch, and for this she was tried. The trial was a long one, and grossly unfair. Charles put out no hand to save her, though she had won him back his crown and saved his kingdom. "I hold to my judge," she cried, as her earthly judges gave sentence against her, "to the King of heaven and earth." She was condemned to die. A great pile was raised in the market-place at Rouen, where now her statue stands. Her martyrdom was as heroic as had been her life. "O Rouen, Rouen," she was heard to murmur, as she looked over the city from her lofty scaffold. "I have great fear lest you suffer for my death. Yes, my voices were from God," she cried suddenly, as the flames curled up around her. Then her head drooped forward, and with one last cry of "Jesus," the Maid of Orleans perished. "We are lost," muttered an Englishman as the crowd broke up. "We have burned a saint." But the French people who loved her tell a story of how, when all was over and the heroic Maid of Orleans was but a heap of smoldering ashes, a beautiful white dove rose up from the smoking pile and flew upward towards the sky. It was the dove of peace, they said, that had spread its wings over the fair land of France, saved by Joan of Arc. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge. Chapter 26. The Sea of Darkness. To open up those wastes of tide, no generation opened before. We now open a wonderful new chapter in the world's history, a chapter full of mystery, adventure, and discovery, when the spirit of enterprise was awakened and the eyes of all men were turned towards the boundless sea of darkness and the unknown lands beyond. It had been a triumphant day for the old Phoenicians when they had at last sailed through the terrible Pillars of Hercules, which were supposed to mark the bounds of the world, and found a great rough sea rolling in beyond the Mediterranean. This farthest point of legendary adventure was now to be the starting point of the new voyagers. Portugal, lying just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or Gibraltar, as we call the narrow passage now, was the home of those who were the first to break the charm of the Mediterranean. Until this time the great sea had been the center of all civilization. Around its shores had been grouped the chief races of mankind, the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, the Greeks and Romans. Over her blue waters the traffic of the world had passed. True, the men of the Middle Ages were beginning to dream of something beyond. Through the dreaded Sea of Darkness had been found narrow belts of light. Ships from Venice braved the dreaded Bay of Biscay to get to the Netherlands for the sake of trading with Bruges and Ghent. It took them 8 long months to reach the bleak North Sea from their sunny waters of the Adriatic. The men of Portugal, the extreme west of Europe, looked out over the rough waters of the Sea of Darkness. Their capital, Lisbon, stood at the mouth of the river Tagus, which flowed into the unknown ocean, and they must often have wondered what lay beyond this great strong sea, the waves of which dashed higher than those of the Mediterranean Sea. Only 5 centuries ago this great Atlantic Ocean, across which steamers from all countries are steaming today, was described by an old writer as a vast and boundless ocean on which ships dare not venture out of sight of land. For even if the sailors knew the direction of the winds, they would not know whither those winds would carry them, and as there is no inhabited country beyond, they would run great risk of being lost in mist and vapor. The limit of the West is the Atlantic Ocean, adds this old writer with certainty. But now a great light was to be shed over this mysterious sea. One man, born and bred in Portugal, was to awake his sleeping nation to the wonderful possibilities of the unknown sea. His name was Prince Henry of Portugal. His father was King John of Portugal, and his mother was an Englishwoman, Queen Philippa. This queen had shared the throne of Portugal with King John for 28 years, and her son Henry was but 20 when she lay dying. He was just starting with his father and 2 brothers for a great Moorish port on the African side of the Straits of Gibraltar. The 3 princes had all asked for knighthood, and the king had decided that they should have a chance of winning their spurs in this African crusade. They were due to sail from Lisbon on July 25, 1415. On the 13th Queen Philippa died. Her last thought was for the success of her husband and sons. "What winds blow so strongly against this side of the house?" she asked. "It is blowing from the north," answered her sons. "It is the right wind for your voyage," she murmured with her last breath. A few days later the motherless princes left Lisbon with their father to win their knighthood. Prince Henry, though the youngest of the 3 brothers, was the first to win knighthood. The king's face was bright with joy as Prince Henry approached him, and he welcomed him with the proposal that, as he had borne himself so gloriously, he should receive the honor of knighthood before his brothers. But the prince besought the king that as his brothers Edward and Pedro were older than he was, they might first receive the honor due to them too. The king was pleased with the young man's modesty, and next day the 3 princes in full armor, each bearing unsheathed the sword the queen had given him, were invested with knighthood. It was 3 years before Prince Henry returned to live in Portugal. He had shown himself a worthy soldier, and his renown stood high in Europe. He received invitations from the Pope, the Emperor of Germany, and the King of England to take command of their armies. But Prince Henry had other ideas for his life. He wanted to learn more of the Sea of Darkness over which he had tossed from Lisbon to the coast of Africa. He wanted to know how far that coast on the west extended, what was beyond the great sea across which man had never yet sailed. These things he yearned to know, and these things he now set himself to learn. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge. Chapter 27. Prince Henry the Sailor. There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sails. There gloom the dark broad seas. Tennyson. Once back from the wars, the purpose of his life now began to take definite shape. Forsaking the gaiety of court life, he took up his abode on the inhospitable shores of southern Portugal. Amid the sadness of a waste of shifting sand, in a neighborhood so barren that only a few stunted trees struggled for existence, on one of the coldest, dreariest spots of sunny Portugal, Prince Henry built himself a palace, a chapel, and an observatory. And here, with the vast Atlantic stretching before him, he devoted himself to the study of the stars, of seamanship, of mathematics. He gathered round him men skilled in the art of drawing maps and men of science. In the neighboring port of Lagos he built new ships and trained the Portuguese sailors in the art of seamanship. Desire to do well. This was the prince's motto, and never did man follow any nobler watchword than this. It was not long before his ships sailed forth in quest of the unknown. Two squires of Prince Henry's household, anxious for fame and wishing to serve their master, set out on an exploring expedition to the coast of West Africa. But being overtaken by a storm, they were driven on an island, which they called Porto Santo, as it had saved them from the dangers of the storm. They returned in triumph to Prince Henry, suggesting that a little colony would thrive on their newly found island. The prince took up the idea, and sent out a little settlement of people to start life on the new island. He also sent with his captain a Spanish pilot who came into his service, relating this story. 50 years before, an Englishman had run away from Bristol with a very beautiful lady. The boat in which they were flying to France was driven by storms out of its course, finally reaching an island, where the lady died of fright and exposure, and her lover a few days later of grief. The sailors who were with them sailed away from the island, only to be wrecked on the coast of Africa and to be thrown into a Moorish prison. But they had told their story to this man, and he was now on his way to act as guide to the island of Madeira. Rediscovered then by the Portuguese, they took it in the name of Prince Henry, and to the Portuguese the islands of Madeira and Porto Santo belong today. Year after year the energetic prince dispatched his little ships on the islands into the unknown sea, ever urging his captains and sailors to venture farther and farther. He gave them new maps and better compasses, and he imparted his enthusiasm to all. To the faint-hearted he gave new courage. Those who listened to fables of the sea he rebuked, until one and all determined not to return till they could report some success to their enthusiastic master. Farther and still farther the ships sailed southward, till at last they reached Cape Bojador, on the west coast of Africa. Here a dangerous surf broke upon the shore, and even the prince's mariners dared not venture farther. There was a popular fable that any man who passed Cape Bojador would be changed from white to black. Men whispered of serpent rocks, sea monsters, water unicorns, of sheets of liquid flame and boiling waters. It was 7 years later that the prince's ships reached Cape Blanco, the white headland beyond. Slowly but surely the fables about the great heat were melting away, and men were venturing farther and farther south, but never far from the coast of Africa, never out into the sea of darkness. But they brought back gold dust from the coast of Guinea, and they brought back some of the black men as captives to Prince Henry, whose wish was that they should become Christians. As ship after ship now returned with gold and captives or slaves, Prince Henry's service became more and more popular. No longer had the sailor prince to beg his men to sail forth. All were eager to go and enrich themselves from this newly discovered land. Love of gain was the magic wand that now drew on the Portuguese sailors into the unknown waters, and made them ready for adventure and dangers. This love of gold and slaves did not appeal to the prince. He still sent out his ships to the west coast, ever hoping for some new light to be shed over the sea of darkness, ever longing for someone to discover a pathway through the great waters to distant India. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge. Chapter 28. A Famous Voyage. The prince, who heaven inspired, to love of useful glory roused mankind, and in unbounded commerce mixed the world. Thomson. Perhaps of all the voyages made in the time of Prince Henry of Portugal, that of the Venetian voyager Cadamosto is the most famous, and we have an account of it in his own words. Sailing from Venice to France, Cadamosto was driven by a storm to shelter in the prince's town near Cape St. Vincent. Here he heard of the glorious and boundless discoveries of the prince's ships, and a passionate desire to see the world and explore the unknown fired him with eagerness to enter the prince's service. No countryman of mine had ever tried the like, and my certainty of winning the highest honor and gain from such a venture made me offer myself, he tells us in his story. On March 21, 1455, Cadamosto sailed for Madeira, then on to the newly found Canary Islands, which had been called the Hanno of old, the Islands of the Blessed, and so to the coast of Africa, landing at the White Cape, Cape Blanco. The natives of Cape Blanco are black as moles, but dress in white flowing robes, says the old traveler and chronicler, with a turban wound round the head. Indeed, plenty of Arabs are always hovering off the Cape for the sake of trade with Prince Henry's ships, especially in silver, grain, and woven stuffs, slaves, and gold. Coasting on to the southward, he came to the great river Senegal, where the natives were of a color something between black and ashes in hue. When first they had seen the ships from Portugal sailing along their coast, they had thought them to be birds coming from afar and cleaving the air with white wings. When the sailors let down the sails and drew the ships to the shore, the natives thought they must be fishes, and they stood stupidly on the shore gazing at the new wonder. On sailed the explorers, south and ever south, till they reached Cape Verde, the most western point of West Africa. The long spell of white sand had now given way to green grass and trees, while native villages were dotted about on the seashore. But the Portuguese knew Cape Verde already. Farther south they did not know. So Cadamosto sailed on. They reached the mouth of the river Gambia and started up the stream to explore farther. But the negroes, sooty black in color, dressed in white cotton with helmets on their heads, 2 white wings on either side and a feather in the middle, came against them. The natives were hostile and unfriendly, so Cadamosto sailed away. He had already sailed farther south than any of the other Portuguese ships, to within measurable distance of the equator, that imaginary line that divides the world in 2 parts. Cadamosto did not know that the world was round. He therefore tells Prince Henry on his return, as a curious piece of information, that the pole star had sunk so low that it almost touched the sea, and that they had seen, in their cruise down the African coast, the brilliant group of stars, the Southern Cross, shining through the wonderful June nights. Cadamosto had done much, but the prince was not yet satisfied. In 1458 he planned a yet longer voyage, giving the command to his most faithful servant, Diego Gomez. His orders had been simple enough. He was just to sail as far as he could, farther and farther south. Would these explorers never find out what lay beyond the Sea of Darkness? Much had been learnt, but how much more remained to be learned? Gomez started forth and sailed beyond Cape Verde, turning due west and coming on the Cape Verde Islands, important today as coaling stations for the large steamers plying between England and Africa and America. He had stories to tell of golden rivers, of gold mines, of ivory tusks and elephant teeth, of houses made of seaweed covered with straw. He returned to Portugal only in time to be present at the death of his beloved master, Prince Henry. Still working for the cause he had at heart, his motto, desire to do well, ever before him, Prince Henry fell ill. In his own town, near Cape St. Vincent, he lay dying, within sound of the great Atlantic rollers, within sight of that vast sea of darkness he had failed to fathom. Perhaps he had done more than ever he dreamt. His energy, his untiring hope, his unwavering purpose and steady determination, had awakened in his countrymen a spirit of enterprise and adventure. He had indeed roused mankind to the love of useful glory, and in unbounded commerce mixed the world. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Discovery of New Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Discovery of New Worlds by M.B. Synge. Chapter 29. The Invention of Printing. In times ere yet the press had blessed mankind, perished unknown the noblest works of mind. McCreary. It seems strange at first sight to connect the discovery of printing with the discovery of new worlds and the navigation of new seas. But it was just at this time that the invention of printing began to play its large part in the world's history. You can imagine how eagerly men would print in books the accounts of the new lands, and how their hearts would glow as they read of the adventures of the stout-hearted sailors who went on voyages of discovery. The first book was printed in Europe just 10 years before the death of Prince Henry the Sailor. But how did men read books before this? Everything was copied by hand. The old Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans wrote with sharply pointed instruments on sheets of dried skins or papyrus made from reeds. They wrote on one side only and rolled it up. A long book would be perhaps 30 yards in length. These rolls or books were kept in jars or wooden boxes, a number of which formed a library. They could only be read by the learned. Among the people there were no books at all. Now 2 countries, Holland and Germany, claim the honor of having invented printing. Nobody quite knows which is right, so here are the 2 stories. The men of Holland say that Coster. One day he took a walk and cut letters on the bark of home and printed them on paper to amuse his children. Then he invented a kind of printing ink to put on the blocks of wood so that they left a mark on the paper. Soon after this he made letters of tin and lead, getting some workmen to come and help him. One night, when Coster was out, one of his workers called John stole all the metal letters, and taking them to Germany, set up a press for himself. But the Germans say that a man called Gutenberg invented printing at a city on the Rhine, that he first thought of making pictures in wood and impressing them on paper by means of ink. Then he made letters or type of metal, and after 7 years of hard work he printed a copy of the Bible. The secret of the printing press soon escaped to other parts of Europe, and presses were set up everywhere. Venice, Spain, and France caught the printing fever. England was not far behind them. The story of how Caxton introduced printing into England is always interesting. News of Gutenberg's discovery reached him, and he went off to Germany to learn the art, knowing what a gain it would be to his country. For 35 years he labored abroad, after which he returned in triumph to England, bringing with him his treasure, a printing press and a book containing a history of Troy, which he had translated and printed with great labor. For mine eyes dimmed with overmuch looking on the white paper, and my courage not so ready to labor as it hath been, he said. There were no bookbinders in those days, so he bound the book himself, and very clumsy it must have looked. The wooden boards between which the leaves were fastened were as thick as the panel of a door. They were covered with leather. Outside on the cover were large brass nails with big heads. The back was stuck with glue laid on thickly, while the book was fastened with a thick clasp. No one can carry it about, much less read it, says one, speaking of the very early books printed by Caxton. When other men would have ceased work, this man worked on. He printed book after book of English poetry for the people to read and know. death. He was not, he was still laboring at the work for